Hello and welcome back to the part 3 of my APS tutorial. In this tutorial I want to go over the various different parts for the ammo customizers. Well, in the next couple videos I want to go over the various different parts of the ammo customizers. This is going to take more than one video just because there are loads of parts. And yeah, so I want to. I've also changed the mic as well. Well, not changed the mic, but changed the settings for the mic. So hopefully it's less bad than it was in the first two videos. Right. Or hopefully less staticky. Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, moving on. I want to talk about the UI to begin with. So before talking about any of the parts, talking about just the UI. So for the UI of the ammo customizer, so the UI is quite convoluted. There's lots of stuff going on. Right, so as you can sort of see in the background here, rotating in the background here, you can sort of see the shell. This shell here, by the way, is the shell I used in part 2. It's the 100mm shell that I hastily threw together in the previous episode. This shell here is not a good shell, but yeah, it just sort of shows you the UI. So here we've got up in the top left here, we've got the current parts. The current parts are the parts of the shell, obviously, and the order of the parts is at the bottom here. At the bottom of the current parts is the top of the shell, the end of the shell, and right at the very top is the back of the shell. And yeah, so it goes in that particular order. And here we've got the selectable parts in the middle here, and the selectable parts shows various different tabs, and this here just shows you all the various different parts. There's I think there's something like 35, 34, something like that, different parts. There's loads of different parts for the loads of different possible parts for the shell. Right, and on here on the right, we've got the part info. This here will tell you a little bit of information, a little bit of stats for the various different parts. If you mouse over the different parts, it gives you a bit of information about them. And it will give you some of the modifiers, like the arm pierce modifier or whatnot, for each of the different parts. Right, okay, and here just below the part info we've got the customization options. So if whatever it is that you have selected has some customization options, they will appear here. And finally we've got the shell statistics, which is this bit at the bottom here. The shell statistics, what it does is it just shows you all the different stats for your current shell at this gauge here that you've set. You set this gauge to whatever you wanted to, and it will show you the stats at that particular gauge. So if I set this back to 100, just because that was the gauge we had before, yeah, so that gives you the stats for the shell we had before. Anyway, moving on, or moving right on in, we've got I want to go into the warheads now. So with the warheads, we've got the simple, I want to start off with the simple chemical warheads. And what the simple chemical warheads are, they are chemical warheads that are, well, relatively simple. So if you put them on your shell, they do what they say on the tin, pretty much. You don't need to do anything fancy, you don't need to mess around with them too much, and they will just function. Right, so starting off, we've got high explosive, which is what I used on that shell from the last part. What high explosive does is, well, pretty much what you'd expect it to. When it detonates, it sort of creates an explosion that does some damage. I should also explain the difference between the body, the high explosive, as you can sort of see in the current parts here. We got high explosive warhead body, and we got high explosive head. There is no difference between these two in terms of damage. in terms of the damage that these two warheads or these two high explosive bits will do, there's no difference in terms of the high explosive damage. However, the only difference is the aerodynamics of the particular part. So if you can sort of vaguely see the shell in the background here that's sort of rotating here. You've got the high explosive head, which is this aerodynamic round head piece, which goes, as you can sort of see here, rotating there. And the head piece, you want to have that on the front of your shell, because it's more aerodynamic. It will give you it's more aerodynamic than the body part at the very least. If the body part here, you can't see it at the moment because of how it's rotated, but the body part is this bit here at the back. You can sort of see it as the shell's rotating. This bit here, the cylindrically shaped part. That part there is the body part, and the body part is not anywhere near as aerodynamic as the head part. So you want the head part at the front of your shell, and you want the body parts in the middle of your shell. If you were to have a body as on the front of your shell, because it wouldn't be as aerodynamic, the speed of the shell here, the expected muzzle velocity, would be considerably worse, and the effective time and range of the shell would be considerably worse as well. Right, so moving on, we've got the flak warhead. The flak warhead is very, very similar to high explosive, and in that when it hits, when you hit an opponent with a flak warhead, if I look this up, we've got the flak warhead and the flak head, just the same as the high explosive. What the flak warhead, the only difference between the flak warhead and the high explosive is when you hit an opponent, it will do, generally with flak, it will do less damage than high explosive. If you look at the expected flak damage here, you've got an expected flak damage at 100 millimeters of 49. And if we go back to the high explosive, you've got an expected explosive damage of 203. So you'll get much more damage out of high explosive warheads than you do out of flak. However, if you look at the flak radius, the radius of the explosion for a flak warhead is 17 meters, which is much, much greater than the radius for a high explosive warhead, which is only 5 meters. So the flak is good if you want to do less damage over a larger area, but the high explosive warheads are better for doing higher amounts of damage over a smaller area. Personally, I don't use flak too often, but I tend to use HE if I need AOE, area of effect. But yeah, so that's those two. Moving on, we got EMP. EMP is very similar to the other EMP options, or the other weapons in From the Depths that have that can do EMP damage, such as pack cannons or crown cannons or missiles. They all have EMP options. And what EMP for advanced cannons, you've also got, you can use EMP in advanced cannons as well. What EMP does when you hit your opponent is it will send an electric, a jolt of electricity through the opponent, and this jolt of electricity will damage the opponent's any electrical parts that the opponent has on their vehicle that are vulnerable to EMP. Yeah, so with using EMP with advanced cannons, I would highly advise you to not use EMP with advanced cannons, because well, it's just simply quite bad. If you want to use EMP, I would advise using either missiles or pack cannons, just because they're a much better way of delivering EMP to the opponent. whilst with APS cannons tend to have you tend to have a higher fire rate with smaller shells, and EMP doesn't tend to really work too well with that. So I personally don't use EMP too often with APS anyway, but it's there if you want to use it. Anyway, moving on, we've got the next type of warhead. We got the kinetic warheads. Again, relatively simple kinetic warheads. The kinetic warheads they have two statistics which factor into the amount of damage that a kinetic warhead will do, and that is every shell will have a kinetic damage stat, and they will have an armor pierce stat, or an AP stat. The effective damage, if you would, for a kinetic shell will be, you can calculate that by multiplying the kinetic damage by the armor pierce, and you will get a number that represents the amount of damage that your kinetic shell will do. What affects the damage with the kinetic shell, or what affects the damage you can do with a kinetic shell? The main thing is speed, the speed of the shell, but the effective mass of the shell is also a thing. The bigger your shell, the more damage. The bigger and faster your shell, the more damage, the more kinetic damage your shell will do. Effectively, which kind of makes sense. So hopping into going into the first part here for the kinetic warheads, we've got the solid warhead. The solid warhead is as simple as it gets. The solid warhead is just a solid part that you can put on your shell, and it's not aerodynamic, so you can only put it in the middle of your shell, and it just adds quite a bit of this. These are the two main stats here, which are the kinetic damage and the armor pierce. What the solid warhead body does is it adds quite a bit of kinetic damage. It adds quite a lot of kinetic damage, but it adds very little armor pierce. Relative to the other parts. It adds a little bit of armor pierce, but not much. Right. Moving on, we got the next part, which is the AP capped head. Right, so the AP capped head, which is this part here, the AP capped head is a headpiece. It can go on the end on the very front of your shell, and with the AP capped head, it's quite an all-round head, quite an all-round kinetic head. If we mouse over the AP capped head and then go on over to the part info, you can see that if you scroll on down, you can sort of see the modifiers, the stats for the AP capped head. So for the AP capped head, the armor pierce modifier, which is this one here, and we have the speed modifier, which is this one here. We got 1.5 speed modifier and 3.5 armor pierce modifier, and that's the all-rounded head, if you would, in terms of stats. If we move on to the next one, we've got the composite head, and the composite head, this one here, the composite head is very, very similar to the AP capped head, it goes on the front of your shell, and it has very similar stats. If we go on over to the part info, you can see the stats here. You've got a speed modifier of 1.6 and an armor pierce modifier of 4.5. So for the composite head, the armor pierce modifier is lower than the AP capped head. However, the speed modifier is slightly higher. So if you use the composite head instead of the AP capped head, your shell will be faster. However, it will have lower armor pierce, and as a consequence, it will do less damage in theory. Moving on, we got the the Sabot. so the sabot warheads. So the sabots come in there's a head form and there's a body form for the sabots. And again, if we look at the stats, if we look at the part info and we look at the stats for the sabot, we've got a speed modifier of 2.05 and an armor pierce modifier of 6.75. As you can, compared to the other heads, the sabot has considerably better stats, which is quite good, or can be quite good. However, sabot, that does come at a disadvantage. Sabot heads have a big drawback to them, and with sabot heads, if you have either a chemical warhead on the shell that you're putting a sabot warhead on, or you have a frag warhead on the shell that you're putting the sabot head on, then the sabot head will remove 75% of the damage that chemical shell or the frag shell will do. So if you had a high explosive warhead on the shell, and that high explosive warhead did 100 damage without the sabot, and then you added the sabot would remove 75 of that damage, 75% of that damage, leaving 25 damage left, which is obviously pretty bad. So the way you get around that is by using the sabot. Do not use any of the chemical warheads or the frag warhead with the sabot. With the sabot, you can use the other kinetic parts, but don't use any of the chemical warheads, because you're going to lose 75% of the damage. So generally that's pretty bad. And moving on, we've got the final piece here, the final one, which is the hollow point. The hollow point is a special head in comparison to the rest, and works a bit differently to the others. The hollow point, in terms of stats, if we look at the stats, we've got a speed modifier of 1.4 and an armor pierce modifier of 0.25. With the hollow point, the armor pierce modifier, even though that's incredibly low, this armor pierce modifier doesn't actually matter. Nor does this, if you're using hollow point, the armor pierce value doesn't actually matter, because no matter what your armor pierce is, when you hit an opponent with a hollow point head shell, then the armor pierce will always be 10. It will always be 10. This can be quite useful because then you don't have to focus on increasing the armor pierce of your shell. So you just have a value of 10, and that can be okay. But generally with larger shells, so with bigger, higher gauge shells, an armor pierce of 10 is pretty bad. So generally you only want to use this on lower gauges, not the lowest of gauges, but on lower gauges, maybe around about 100 millimeters maybe. Generally with hollow point, you want to mix. You want to have like a hollow point head and then a whole bunch of the solid bodies to create the most effective hollow point shell. And because the solid bodies, they don't give much armor pierce. They don't have much armor pierce, but they give you loads of kinetic damage. So having the 10 armor pierce from the hollow point head can be quite good. Another weird thing or another different thing, should I say, with the hollow point is how it does damage when you hit the opponent. So with all the other kinetic shells, with all the other kinetic parts, if you hit your opponent, the kinetic damage will sort of burrow into the enemy. So if you hit the side of the enemy, the damage that your kinetic shell will do will kind of go into the enemy. It will go in the direction that the shell sort of hit the enemy, which kind of makes sense. But what a hollow point shell will do is, instead of the damage going in the direction that the shell came in, that the shell hit the enemy at, the damage will propagate at 90 degrees to the angle that the shell hit the opponent at. which means that the damage, instead of going into the opponent, it will go along the side of the opponent. So it will rip off a big, potentially the hollow point could rip off a large hole in the side of the opponent, but it won't be a very deep hole. It will just sort of rip off the outer layer of the opponent's armor potentially, which could be really good because that large hole could potentially let in, if you're firing if you're firing multiple shells, then further shells could go into that hole that you've created and go further into the opponent. And hollow points generally do quite a bit of damage, but the main disadvantage for your hollow point is that whilst they will do loads of damage to the opponent's hull, they will generally they won't end up damaging anything that's important. So when you're fighting an opponent, you want to destroy their guns, you want to destroy their ammo, you want to destroy their AI, the important things. But generally with the hollow point, you're just going to end up destroying the opponent's armor, which is not always the most effective, of things. So yeah, right. So that's it for the kinetic warheads. Moving on to the frag warhead. I've put this in a category of its own, just because it doesn't really fit in the chemical warheads and it doesn't really fit in the kinetic warheads. It's sort of a bit of both. The warheads on the frag shell itself, they behave like chemical warheads. However, the fragments that the frag warhead spawns, they behave like kinetic shells, or they do kinetic damage. So it doesn't really fit in either category. So with the frag warheads, what we've got is you've got the frag head and the frag warhead body, just the same as you would with the chemical warheads. And what the frag shell will do is when the frag shell detonates, it sends out a cone of fragments in a direction of your choosing, in a cone of your choosing. And if we go over to here to the customize part here, you can set for the fragment warhead body here, you can set the cone angle and you can set the elevation offset. So what the cone angle is for frag is it's the cone or the angle or the cone in front of the shell that the fragments will go out in. So if I set this to 180 degrees, this here will send fragments in all possible directions when the shell explodes. So fragments will go in all directions. However, if I set this to 1 degree, then it will send all of the fragments in a tiny 1 degree cone, in a really tight 1 degree cone in front of the shell. And so it'll concentrate all the damage, if you would. And if I set this to some value in between, like 90, then it will send all of the fragments in front of the shell. Right, and something else with the frag cone is that if I set this to a value, so say I set it to 180 and look at the fragment damage. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the how you calculate damage with fragment shells. You've got a number of fragments and you've got a fragment damage. So effectively, the damage that your fragment shell will do is the fragment damage, or the damage per fragment, multiplied by the number of fragments. So that's the effective damage that your shell could do if all of your fragments hit. So if we look at the so at the moment I've set the cone angle to 180 degrees, and if we look at the fragment damage, we've got 267 damage, which is quite good. If I set this, however, if I set this cone angle to 1 degree, notice how the fragment damage has dropped significantly. It's dropped to 137, which is a lot lower than what it was. But the trade-off is even though all the fragments are concentrated into a 1 degree cone, the fragments themselves are doing less damage. So potentially, you want to find a happy medium, if you would. So you want to find a value sort of in between, so maybe 90 degrees or something, to you want to find a value where most of the fragments will hit the opponent, and you want a cone angle that's low enough that most of the fragments will hit the opponent, but you want a frag cone angle that's high enough that the fragment damage is still acceptable. Also, you've got the elevation offset. What the elevation offset does is it changes the angle at which the cone comes out. So at the moment, if this is set to 0, the frag cone will come out the front of the shell. If I set this to 90 degrees and I've got this cone angle set to 90 degrees as well, then what this will do is it will send the frag cone 90 degrees upwards. So it will send the frag cone directly upwards from the shell, which, if you want to do that, and you can also set it to -90 to send the fragments downwards as well, if you wanted to send the frag cone downwards. Or you can set it to any value in between. I would advise leaving that at 0, unless you're planning to undershoot the enemy or overshoot the enemy. Then setting an elevation offset is generally fairly useless. I'm yet to find a good use for the elevation offset. Anyway, moving on to the final warheads, the quote-unquote complex warheads. The complex warheads, what they are, the reason that they're slightly more complex, quote unquote, is that they require a bit more setting up to get them to work. So the first, so coming in here, we got the first complex shell here. We've got the heat shell. So heat standing for high explosive anti-tank. And what the heat shell does is when you hit your opponent with a heat shell, it will create a small explosion. You've got expected explosive damage here. It will create a small explosion on the side of the opponent. What it will do as well as that explosion is it will send molten copper fragments into the opponent through the opponent's armor. So these molten copper fragments, they can damage things on the inside of the opponent. So if you hit the opponent's armor right behind, right next to where the opponent's turret is or where their ammo is, potentially you could end up blowing up their turret or destroying their ammo without having to destroy the armor around the ammo or around the turret, which can obviously be really, really good. Right, so yeah, that's the basic gist of how heat shells work. If you add to make a heat shell more powerful, you would you can add high explosive warheads to the shell as well, to make it a bit more potent. So yeah, moving on, we've got a very, very similar shell, HESH. HESH is high explosive squash head, and what a HESH shell does is when it hits the opponent is pretty similar to heat. It will create a very small explosion on the side of the opponent, and it will do a large amount of thump damage, which is that number there. And the thump damage, as far as I'm aware, works quite a lot like the kinetic damage. Then what it does by thumping the side of the opponent's armor is it will create a shock wave that goes through the opponent's armor. And this shock wave, once it reaches the inside of the opponent's armor, it can create spalling on the inside of the opponent's armor. And spalling, if you can create spalling on the spalling on the inside of the opponent's armor, that spalling can potentially damage things on the inside. So if there's an ammo, the ammo cache, or the turret, so the opponent's turret is behind the armor or something, then potentially you can end up blowing up their turret or their ammo. again, just like you could with heat, without having to go through the, without actually having to destroy the armor first, which, obviously could be really good. Yeah, with HESH, it's very similar to heat, except with HESH, it's dependent upon what the damage that the HESH does, that the HESH sprawling does, is dependent upon the armor that your opponent is made out of. If your opponent has heavy armor, if you manage to create spooling on heavy armor or metal, then you will do a lot. The fragments that will create will do way more damage than the fragments that would be created from if the opponent was made out of wood, if the opponent's armor was made out of wood, because essentially you're sending fragments of heavy armor flying around inside of the opponent instead of fragments of wood. Fragments of wood doing considerably less damage. It's much softer armor. But yeah, so HESH is dependent upon what the opponent's made out of, whilst heat is not dependent upon what the opponent's made out of. Heat doesn't care what the opponent's made out of. So heat's more consistent, but if the opponent's made out of stronger materials, HESH could potentially do more damage. You can increase the strength of the HESH warhead, you can increase the strength of the HESH shell by adding high explosive on the back, just the same with the heat shell. And yeah, so that's all of the warheads. That's all I wanted to cover in this particular video. Yeah, so in the next video I want to go on and cover possibly the fuses maybe, and talk about propellants for the shell, and yeah, so that'll come in part 4, I guess we're on now, aren't we? So yeah, so thanks for watching, and yeah, so cheerio.